Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Smartest Path to a Secure Cloud. We have a large number of folks joining us today, so we'll give them a couple more minutes to log in, and then we'll get started. Please stand by. Hello, everyone. We are ready to get started. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Mark Carney, Executive Vice President of Cybersecurity Services at Coalfire. Before we move into the presentation, let's review a few housekeeping items. You may submit questions throughout the webinar using the question area of your control panel. During the Q&A portion of the webinar, we'll take as many questions as possible until the top of the hour, and we'll answer those remaining questions via email. This webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive a PDF of the slides and a link to the archived recording of the webinar. Now let's look at the agenda that we have for today. After introducing the panelists, we'll cover key components and best practices for building a cloud strategy. We will then look at considerations when planning a shift to the cloud. We'll discuss key challenges, pitfalls, and risks introduced by a cloud environment, and best practices for managing your cloud environment. And finally, we'll wrap up with some final comments from our panelists as well as Q&A. So let's introduce our speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today's webinar. First is Kurt Hagerman. Kurt is a CISO advisor with Coalfire. Kurt brings more than 30 years of security operations and leadership and executive experience in the field of information technology. Among Kurt's many executive roles, he spent 6 years as the CISO for Armor Defense. Our second panelist today is Tony Spinelli. Tony has spent his entire 25-plus year career devoted to advancing and developing and pioneering digital technology and cybersecurity capabilities. He has held executive and chief information security officer roles for some of the world's most critical companies, including Capital One, Tyco, Equifax, and First Data Corporation. He is currently a professor of digital technology and cybersecurity at George Washington University, in addition on being the faculty of the National Association of Corporate Directors, as well as public board member for Blue Cross Blue Shield and PPAC Gladstone Bank. Our third panelist, Joe Gottlieb, is a Senior Vice President of Strategy and Business Development at SailPoint. He has over 2 decades of experience in a variety of executive roles at security and enterprise technology companies in Silicon Valley. Before joining SailPoint, he was the CEO of Aerospike. He has also held executive positions as the CEO at SynSage, Vice President of Corporate Strategy at McAfee, and executive positions at Nokia, the Meta Group, and EY. Welcome, gentlemen. And with that, let's get the dialogue started. So we talk about cloud, and there's lots of content out there. There's lots of discussion, and clearly a top-of-mind discussion and topic around security, for instance, for sure. So a very foundational question that we'll talk about and start the dialogue here is, why move to the cloud in the first place? And so, Tony, please, if you could start us off here and kind of share your thoughts around why do we move to the cloud? Why do people consider moving to the cloud here in the first place?
Well, thanks, Mark, and thanks for the introduction, and great to be with everyone today. I think there is some variability in why you move to the cloud. I think different businesses have different reasons. I think many believe certainly could be a cost savings opportunity. But certainly, I think what's happening now is most companies are considering the movement to digital. It certainly is an imperative for businesses requiring the changes in customer demand and being responsive to customer demands and requirements much more quickly. Moving to the cloud really allows companies to be agile with their infrastructure while developing and adapting solutions to respond to the changes in customers' demand. You can't really make a product today, place it in a position of marketing and believe that you're not going to be making changes sometimes on a daily basis, which has been my experience at two major Fortune 500 companies that moved to the cloud. Is you had to be able to respond quickly to changes in customer demand, and certainly cloud infrastructure was a way to do that. So while having focused, I think, in the past on effectiveness and efficiency, Web 3.0, which is really more of an interactive model, requires much more adaptability and resiliency, which is best serviced by the cloud.
Thank you, Tony. Joe, what any other additional thoughts around why folks should consider moving to the cloud?
Yeah, this is Joe. Happy to be here on the panel today. I would just add to what Tony was sharing. Just if you look back at previous eras, whether it's mainframe to client server or client server to web, those big changes were typically driven by the fact that the most advanced and economical technology was showing up in a new place. And I think that's what we have for sure happening with the cloud. And as Tony mentioned, it's not just about saving money at the end of the day. It's about this greater agility. It's about getting away from some of the headaches of running computing on your own now that you don't have to, right? That's yet another thing you don't have to also master and continue to sustain if you can leverage cloud services. Of course, there's the economies, but it's also where the APIs are showing up. It's where your best developers want to be in terms of advancing their careers. It's where the most investment is being made in terms of Silicon Valley pumping new investment into new technologies. And while it represents a new place, and that involves change that we have to master, and we'll be talking about that throughout this panel discussion, it represents opportunity, right, to take advantage of the new stuff that's showing up, the places that people want to be to evolve the enterprise portfolio.
And Kurt, any additional perspective from your vantage point and experiences?
Well, it's nice to join everybody. Thanks for taking the time. Yeah, I think Tony and Joe pretty much said it all. I guess I can bottom line it by saying that cloud is the new IT. It is the way that IT is being done, and so I think that's another reason. When we talk about companies moving to the cloud, most are already in the cloud in some form factor. If they're using Office 365 or customer relationship tools like Salesforce or HR systems, many organizations are already in the cloud, and that is just the way that IT is being done. So I think that kind of bottom lines it for me.
I appreciate it, Kurt. So if we switch to and kind of shift to organizations that are considering the moving to the cloud. So we talked about the why. Let's talk about the how. So how do you determine, what are the thought processes of really what organizations need to be thinking about and to determine when and what to move to the cloud? And then, the other question is, does it always make sense to move to the cloud? So Joe, maybe start us out with some thoughts around this topic.
Sure. I think let's tackle the second one head on. It doesn't make sense for everything, and it really comes down to the way that you would choose to prioritize how you capture the benefits of the cloud, right? Knowing that you're going to want to maintain or improve both your service levels and your security with anything that you move over to the cloud. And we'll talk a lot about security throughout this panel discussion. But one of the things to consider is that if you're wrapping an older application and enabling it to run in the cloud, or you're addressing it and while it still runs as a legacy, but you're wrapping it with new cloud services, you need to always be thinking then about how do I keep my service level up and also my security controls that are reflecting this new opportunity. And in some cases, you won't find the combination of things you need, or you'll need to figure out how to construct that combination of things to maintain those security controls and your service levels. So an example might be sometimes cloud services don't offer as granular a security paradigm as we might require. Some of them can't support older connectivity protocols and session scenarios, right, that we're still running in some of these places. So it comes back down to architecture. It comes down to operationally how you're going to be able to manage the changed elements of your portfolio. And so being able to look at that as a portfolio and looking at service levels, looking at security controls, and then prioritizing accordingly is a key part of how to get rolling and identify the right things to move to the cloud based upon your preparation and continue to evolve that practice.
Thank you, Joe. Kurt, your perspective on this particular topic here.
Yeah, I think I'll take a little bit more of a business-focused approach than Joe. I mean, I agree. It doesn't necessarily make sense just to jump into the cloud, feet first. I think the business needs to take a look at how can they best take advantage of the efficiencies and all of the agility and everything that the cloud has to offer, and how does using the cloud best further the business's goals and objectives. I'm an old school guy. If it's not broke, don't fix it. If there are legacy applications that are running your business that you have tried and true methods and processes around, and the value of trying to move those and port those over to the cloud is marginal at best, then I think you need to consider where you get the best value and where you get the most support for furthering your business goals and objectives. Certainly, new product development and new applications, there's probably a really good case for utilizing cloud. It provides all kinds of the things that Joe and Tony have already talked about in terms of agility and even security. But again, I think it goes back to what makes sense is what's going to get you the best business enablement out of going to the cloud.
And Tony, your final thoughts here on these questions?
Sure. I think just to be overt about it, it might not always make sense to move to the cloud, right? Depending on the enterprise goals. It certainly depends on your business and the customer imperatives that you have. I think one of the questions that needs to be asked is, and this is certainly for those novice businesses to the cloud is, are you talking about software as a service, platform as a service, or really, infrastructure as a service when you're thinking about, moving to the cloud? Each business and industry is really unique, and you need to have skills, teams, and the right partners to exploit capabilities in the cloud. For example, if you were going to really determine, what can you move simply, it might make sense to start thinking about SaaS versions of what you're running on-premise. As things as simple as email, calendaring, and collaboration before analyzing, in-house developed applications, right, to, move to the cloud and thinking more about, how is the organization ready if we really want to do infrastructure as a service in the cloud, which is a whole different ballgame from simply, leveraging something as simple as email in the cloud, rather than moving in-house developed apps. So I think it's important to really understand context of what you're talking about when you're thinking about moving to the cloud.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. So if we look at, the journey, the cloud journey for customers and organizations, once they establish and determine that they should be in the cloud and kind of what's the scope of their cloud environment, what are some key essential elements for moving to the cloud? What are the considerations as we move to the cloud that are maybe different than legacy environments on-prem? Kurt, maybe start us out with a few thoughts around essential elements for moving to the cloud.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think probably one of the most key elements is having a governance program in place for how you're going to leverage and utilize the cloud. When you start thinking about the hundreds and thousands of cloud services out there, even the thousands of cloud services that are provided by any of the major public cloud providers, you have to have set up some guardrails in terms of how you're going to leverage and utilize that, especially when it comes to security, because not all of these services are created equal or have the same security posture. So taking a look at what services you're going to use, kind of maybe taking a service catalog approach where you're evaluating the services that are there from not only a functionality perspective but also from a security perspective, and looking at those that you're sure you can use with little to no modification, maybe another bucket of services where in order to use them securely and within your own environment, you have to add some elements or add some additional backing around them. And then potentially there are going to be services that you might decide that shouldn't be used or leveraged at this point because they're too new or you don't have the expertise to leverage them. So I think really for me it's setting up the guardrails and the governance around how to go about utilizing and leveraging the cloud. That's probably the most important baseline fundamental. And then obviously you have to understand, what the talent of your team is and other things. But I'll let some of the others speak more to that perspective.
Tony, this one particularly would love to get your insight around your experience around moving at least a couple of very large international organizations to the cloud. Love to get your perspective on this particular question.
Thanks for that, Mark, and certainly enjoyed Kurt's comments as well. I think, when you think about the essential elements, and I wrote a blog on the NACD that you can take a look at, specifically on this question, is you have to think about sequencing. And this is where a lot of enterprises have failed with their movement to digital and cloud is you start doing things out of order, and it matters significantly with regard to your compliance posture, your security posture, and your ability to be effective for your customers. So I'm going to just give, our listeners, 4 things to start with. And I'd say first, you really have to assess the organization's readiness to move to the cloud along multiple dimensions. And I see those multiple dimensions as, culture, talent, and capability, right? What's the culture of the tech organization? Is it ready and prepared, and does it understand how things are going to be different as we move to the cloud? Do we have the talent, and do we have the processes and capability already adapted, right? We have to think about that. I'd say number 2, just as important, you got to choose a partner, right? Especially if you're coming from moving, we're going to now have this cloud journey. Pick your partner wisely. Get a partner that can help you assess risks and opportunities and help you with perhaps a readiness scorecard. I'd say third, review your assessment and scorecard with conviction and understand, what are you good at, where should we partner, and what should we build as we continue this journey. Or even what's too much risk, right? Look at all the different services from whatever cloud provider you're going to use and determine these are too risky, these are not too risky, or here's the ones that we have to do something with to use these specific services of this provider. And then lastly, I think you have to understand your on-premise environment very well and what could be ported to the cloud. And then build a roadmap of a sequence of events and capabilities you have in place. And then I think once you've done that, you're really prepared to start beginning and thinking thoughtfully about your transition to the cloud.
Great insights. Appreciate it, Tony and Kurt. On this particular next question, I'd love to get Joe and Kurt your thoughts. How do we look at security different, and kind of what changes from an on-prem model to a cloud approach? I'd love to get your perspective, Joe. Maybe we start with you on this one.
Yeah, just before I dive into that, I want to add something to what Kurt and Tony said on the last topic. Kurt highlighted the sort of the culture of the approach, and Tony highlighted some great steps to take to make that really a sort of a methodology for how you tackle this. I think that maybe something that might tie the two together for our listeners is that you really have to decide if you are leveraging your tech stack to be aggressive and compete, and you want to be you want to be more on the DIY side, right? So cloud offers a lot of new opportunities to leverage technology more effectively than perhaps previous models, but you're either going to be driving it hard and figuring out your technology architecture, and that might lean you more towards IaaS, where IaaS, infrastructure as a service, is a way to still architect but leverage computing as a utility, right, that's available from the IaaS providers. The SaaS apps that we've been alluding to, right, they tend to offer single version software that gets updated, so there's less ongoing maintenance with upgrade paths and the like. For those folks that are willing to adopt what the SaaS app provides, right? So usually it's a pretty prescriptive model for how that function is operated. You can find APIs for how you might stitch it into other things if you are being forward-leaning. So these are not, it's not binary, but you're either looking at that and you're driving forward an architecture directly or with a partner, or you're adopting more prescriptive approaches. And per the comments made by both of the other panelists, right, you might mix and match depending upon your risks and your appetite in one area versus another. And so that's going to be true of security as well. So as you migrate your portfolio from what we've had in the past, which is more of a legacy on-prem approach, to being either full cloud, which some folks are doing, but more typically for the enterprise, it's a hybrid, right? You want to be able to apply these same concepts now to the cloud. And everything from your mindset for how you're driving your tech stack forward with your business partners, as well as the way that you're applying security, which I'll talk about in just a second, and then of course the way that you're operating the entire model. I look at how zero trust as a concept, right, something we've been talking about for almost a decade now, really exposed the naivete of trusting the network. And so we got to a point where we realized, the network is not trustworthy. We can't trust the network. Well, the same is true now of a lot of our systems. And because of the way that the attackers come in is they're looking to leverage credentials, right, and move laterally and get to the good stuff, right? So we really have to build a set of controls that span the hybrid environment, both on-prem and IaaS and SaaS, so that we can be very, very certain about how people are using the cloud within the context and within the requirements that we have for security. And I think in that regard, identity has risen as a really, really important concept. When you hear people say identity is the new perimeter, what that really translates to is, yes, we have lots of systems. Yes, we have lots of networks. On average, they can't be trusted to be operated appropriately. We have to examine who has access to what, how they're using that access, and we have to continuously evolve the way that that portfolio is allowed to operate while introducing concepts such as least privilege, multi-factor authentication, and a continuous pruning of the access permissions that should be made available to users based upon their role in the organization.
That's great, Joe. Definitely a unique perspective there coming from SailPoint, and definitely agree with you that identity is absolutely key around what changes around this model. Kurt, your perspective maybe on this, coming from obviously your past experiences, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I think fundamentally the security mission stays the same. It's really the implementation of the security that's different. A lot of the legacy security tools that we're all familiar with don't necessarily work well in the cloud. When you start looking at the service-based architecture and the microservice-based architecture that's available in the cloud, you oftentimes don't have operating systems to install agents on. So you have to start looking at how do I apply the same security principles in the cloud world, and it shifts I think where you look, you have to look more at communications between these services, so things like API security and that have not traditionally been well thought out in a legacy environment. I also think that you do have to take a look at your ultimate cloud environment. Is it hybrid? Is it you've got SaaS, you've got IaaS, you've got some on-prem stuff? It has to be a seamless security approach, because you can't afford to manage separate programs for each of the separate environments. You're not going to have 3 different security operations teams. So you have to start looking for tools and processes that can span all 3 of those. And I think most importantly, when you're using the cloud, you have to look to the cloud for how are they providing you with information and data and tools that allow you to manage those interactions within that cloud architecture, that cloud infrastructure more effectively. Most of the cloud providers give you lots of information, AWS with Cloud Trails and CloudWatch and flow logs, and they're starting to roll out more security event platforms where they're taking all of the data that they collect and they're crunching it down and giving you the more interesting bits to look at. So if you have to take advantage of the cloud to help protect the cloud. Trying to do it at scale using legacy tools is just not going to work because of the volume of data that's available. So I think it's really an implementation difference. It's a looking at what works, what are the important elements, and certainly Joe's absolutely right on with identity being a much more focused area, because that is how people, and especially it's not just users' identities, it's also role identities. It's how do APIs authenticate? How do you have services that cross-authenticate to each other? So that's all part of identity. That's all part of access control. So it's just leveraging the new technologies, and especially leveraging the functionality that is available within the cloud to help secure it.
Thanks, Kurt. So we've talked about the how, the why, the when, some key considerations. Let's shift a little bit around, what's the talent that is needed, as well as the cultural impacts sort of within the organization, and making this shift with obviously the drive in this digital era that we live in around digital transformation as a competitive advantage. Tony, I'd love to start with you around your experiences, maybe in Capital One and Tyco specifically. What's been your experience around these elements of kind of moving to the cloud?
Yeah, it's really, I think, was probably the most remarkable part of the journey, which, one would consider, how can that be given, this is such a technical change. So, if I was doing this again, for both of the large enterprises I moved to the cloud, this is where I would have pulled out my pen and paper if I had someone to listen to about, how to think thoughtfully about the cultural changes to the organization, as well as the talent challenges you're going to run into. So I'll try to be pretty simple with these remarks, but yeah, I think these are the ones you need to write down. So number one, when you're making this kind of transition, you're going to definitely change the type of talent that you need. So number one, training programs are important. You may, especially if you're a large, IT organization and a large cyber program, the talent that you have today may not be the talent that's going to get you where you need to go. So number one, you may need that training program for whatever cloud service that you decide you want to pull in, whether it's one of the big 3 around GCP, AWS, or Azure, or some other. You really want that expertise in terms of driving a training program and getting access to training for those in your IT shop, right? So if you think about data center operations and racking and stacking servers and configuring technologies to you devices for you devices, that really doesn't exist. Those same folks that you're going to, that were running data center ops now have to understand JSON, for example, right? And how do I code server infrastructure from a console, right? So, building those training programs, which we did, what you may find is that someone that's been in their career for, 10, 15 years in data center ops may not want to all of a sudden be working on a console where they're, thinking in terms of JSON or, pointing and clicking to build servers. And they may opt out, which we've certainly experienced where I was, right, is, if you've got that much tenure and the job market's never been better than ever, why not just continue your career somewhere else, right? So that's one of the things you have to really think about is, what's the cultural impact of the talent we have, and how do we think about that differently with regard to training programs. I think you're going to have to think about getting direct hires where you can bring in an expertise that's worked in this way, and then make what they've done somewhat viral in terms of what's worked and what hasn't, where your new direct hires that are used to working in this new cloud native way can spread that throughout your organization. And then I think lastly, as you think about culture and skills, you have to pick a great third-party partner. You're not going to be able to be successful as a cyber leader or tech leader without a great partner that's done this before, that can give you the advice you need both strategically and then sometimes tactically, right? Having a team there that can train your team, or a team there that can help you with implementation of cloud infrastructure is going to be really imperative for you to accelerate your program. So, again, don't underestimate the cultural impact. It's going to be much more significant than you believe.
Thank you, Tony. Joe, any observations from your experience that you could share around kind of skill and cultural impacts?
Yeah, I love all those things shared by Tony just now. I would totally agree with them. And to build on them, what maybe I would add would be that not always just dictated by the change to cloud, but also what's happening in IT at the same time. So there's not always a cause and effect here, but what's going on these days is really driving your change with good design, like good product management. So IT is evolving to be better at managing its product, right? Thinking about user experience, thinking about how digital transformation can harness technology to have a great business impact, as we've been talking about. And what goes along with that, just given the age and what's possible, and frankly what competition is forcing each enterprise to consider, is more of an automation mentality. Also, more of an orientation around data-driven decisions. When you think about the cloud, when offered as a service, whether it's IaaS or SaaS or what have you, to offer that as a service, it competes more effectively when it's also better detailed with data, right? And so we can monitor things more directly. We can make more data-driven decisions. That allows us to approach things with more of a collaborative, can-do attitude, but applying that within the controls established by the executive chain. What do I mean by that? Security in the past has perhaps gotten a reputation of being the department of no. And we can't whipsaw and reflex over to being the department of yes, but we ought to be the department of how. You hear about people talking about this, right? Okay, so how can we go make this business change possible? How can we move aggressively with the right controls in place? So more of that sort of mindset for engaging the opportunity and helping the organization with the expertise we have in security to be able to be successful. And then last but not least, I think this will fit back into some of our earlier comments, fitting within a risk management construct that is owned and stewarded by the management chain, the executive team, and the board. Increasingly, boards are having to really understand what digital security really means, and how to reclaim ownership of the risk associated with it, like good boards do, right? Boards have been doing that forever in other domains that are better understood. The cyber domain is one that the board is reclaiming as an ability to actually own that risk and drive the risk governance, right? And so being able to have a conversation with the board about priority investments in security, along with your investments in your digital transformation, the way your business is changing, and having that fit throughout the chain and fitting with those controls we've been talking about that you want to embed in your projects, that's really a key thing to build in.
So let's shift a little bit around the perspective that an organization has assets, infrastructure, data in the cloud. We're going to couple these next two questions together. Let's talk about new risks to expect as well as assessing them, the ongoing, but also let's share maybe some experiences around challenges, pitfalls, and mistakes that you've observed either through peers or maybe even personally through the journey around the organizations you've been a part of. So, Tony, maybe you can share a little bit about the risks, challenges, pitfalls, and mistakes that maybe you've seen and observed throughout your tenure.
Sure. No, thanks, Mark. I think some of the risks and challenges that you really have to be careful for is, how IT changes when when you're moving to cloud and everything you're doing is focused on a DevOps perspective around controls, deployment methods. You're moving from a place where perhaps you had, a system development lifecycle methodology that was waterfall. I think there's still a lot of waterfall out there where now you may be moving to Agile and doing this in the cloud where all of a sudden you have developers not only building code, promoting their own code, but guess what? There's no IT support, right? Developers now support code that's in production. And I think where the challenge of the pitfall comes is that enterprises get really ahead of themselves with wanting to be digital quickly, moving to the cloud quickly, transforming to become agile around these, applicable areas of the cloud when it comes to development, not understanding how the controls change. So you really have to watch out for, how are we controlling what we're doing even though we're moving faster, we're using the cloud, and we're being agile. What controls have to be built in? How do I build those governance processes? And I think one of the key solutions is, and it worked successfully where we did this once, was we transformed the cybersecurity organization to be cloud first and became the cloud experts for the enterprise before the rest of the enterprise moved, which gave the cybersecurity organization the opportunity to build those controls in and bake in all the compliance and governance processes, and then pull the enterprise through that tunnel created faster. And I think that's where you're seeing much more success now, especially, as boards understand it, and discussions I have with boards is they've kind of went through this failure period where everyone tried to move fast. They skipped steps. They did things out of sequence and were very concerned why they were bearing all of these risks in processes where formerly they were completely well controlled, and didn't really understand that, everything changes when you adjust data center ops, when you adjust the development life cycle to be agile. You have to think completely different around controls. That's why it's super important when you think about these new risks that you're creating to really focus on moving, cyber and the cyber organization to be cloud first directly before you move the enterprise.
Very thoughtful, Tony. Joe, anything to add here on these pitfalls, challenges, and moving to the cloud?
Yeah, I love the notion of IT becoming enabled and then pulling the organization through that tunnel based upon that understanding. Really good imagery there, Tony. And so with that in mind, right, the typical pitfall is the business decides it wants to go run toward a new SaaS app or a new capability that needs to show up on IaaS. And they're very anxious to get rolling, and organizations often have momentum, and you see a lot of adoption outside of this ability then to wrap that adoption scenario, that project, with these controls that we're talking about, right? So it really is, a key pitfall here is getting ahead of yourself without being able to anticipate those controls that you need to put in place for operating the capability, for securing it, for then monitoring, and of course responding to events, security events that are going to happen inevitably. I'll give you an example. As you see, the GDPR and other similar regulations continue to evolve. This GDPR, this right to be forgotten, is a key driver for some very important infrastructure evolution right now. And so any given SaaS app might have the way that they're going to offer that to you, and they're going to be very clear about the ownership of data and the regulations, the requirements, and the contracts surrounding that. But as an enterprise, we have to orchestrate the holistic right to be forgotten across all of our systems. So being able to anticipate that, okay, I'm going to have customer data in these different places, and this new SaaS app wants to share in some of it to perform this function. Okay, now I've got a sharing of that data, and I really have to get my arms around now, how does my holistic need to deliver on right to be forgotten evolve with this new functionality that the business wants? And I want to support their adoption of it, but I want to do so within the context of these controls and my ability to stay on top of things.
So we'll talk a little bit around how do we build a single program when your organization utilizes cloud, on-prem, and hybrid environments. Kurt, obviously you're out in talking to our clients at Coalfire. What is sort of your recommendation? What do we want to sort of employ with our customers when they've got these organizations that utilize many different aspects to a cloud environment and moving to the cloud and kind of having a single holistic program that kind of manages all of them together in kind of a single view? What are the things that you're sharing and hearing out there with our clients in the discussions?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think that, again, like I said in a previous response, you have to look at the overall security mission and enact, processes that allow for security to be managed across multiple different environments, whether it be on-prem or an IaaS or even a SaaS application. Much like how you construct traditional security policies or high-level statements about how security is important, and then the actual procedures, how that policy is implemented, can vary from department to department within your organization based upon how that best fits them. I think that's kind of the same approach you need to take with your security program in the cloud, is taking a look at, once again, that governance and those guardrails for how you're going to leverage and use the cloud, and then creating guidelines and guidance that says this is how it's going to be important, and then also providing that sort of consulting guidance, if you will, to each of the operational arms of the organization so that they can make sure that they're implementing it based upon their needs. There is no one security program. You can't just say, here it is, go implement it. It is very customized to your organization and needs to be addressed in that way. So you start with, what is the security mission? What are you trying to do? And then build out the processes within each of those environments that do try to, and find tools and vendors, even maybe third parties, who can help you knit that together into, and I hate to use this term, the single pane of glass, because I think that's gotten old, but you have to have a very consolidated view across all the environments, of especially all the security events, in order to be effective at protecting your environment.
That's great, Kurt. So maybe Joe first or second, and Tony real quick, if you could both share just a quick snippet here on this particular topic as we move to metrics as our final topic, just so we have ample time to discuss that. So if you could share a few quick thoughts here, and then we'll move into metrics as kind of our final topic of the webinar.
Sure. So really quickly, so we Zero Trust was originally applied to the network. I would suggest people, and we see this more and more, apply Zero Trust to privileged system and data access, which requires very explicit and often different controls for each of your environments. And so, for example, anticipating the inevitable adoption of shared cloud storage, be it Box, Dropbox, SharePoint, OneDrive, vetting and standardizing the platform, and then rolling it out to the enterprise so that you can actually support that very powerful productivity system, but with these right controls. Another one is privileged access management, right? This doesn't scale with super admins picking who should have privileged access. You have to make the business continuously govern the way that that privileged access is allocated and then monitored, right? Back to the data monitoring. With clouds, we get a lot more data. We should be consuming that data, looking at usage, and removing privileges that aren't being used, because that is the unnecessary attack surface area that the bad guys are after.
Tony, any thoughts?
Yeah, so as we think about this, I'm going to try to connect the two, Mark, is talk a little bit about the program and then jump right into the metrics part. Is I think one size certainly doesn't fit all. And one of the things I think that's exciting for cybersecurity leaders is this is really your opportunity for a reset, right? A lot of us, that have on-prem environments and we're moving to the cloud, there's a lot of legacy challenges, whether it's end-of-life, server infrastructure, wrangling data, all of those numerous problems that we've all had as, CISOs over, a long period of time. This is your reset opportunity, right? It is, leverage the standards, whether it's NIST or another one that you like, or, high trust, depending on your industry, and leverage that into, how you think about your security program for hybrid or, cloud, for that matter. And, just pick different controls, but make sure you've got, all of your bases covered with that. Because as you think about it, I think one of the things that's, we've always had challenging problems with on-prem is how do we wrangle the data that we need into a SIEM or some other structure to make the decisions we need to make. And I think as you move to the cloud, that's really your opportunity is, the data is there for you. There's no wrangling the data. It's all there. You have to put it in some construct where you're making decisions about, security better, but you're not having to chase data from a multitude of various different, things that you purchase for your security program. It's just kind of right there in the cloud. So you have to think completely different about how you use data and build your metrics program. I think, thinking about the concept of unlimited computing, how do you leverage an unlimited computing environment for the benefit of security, right? How do you scale up when you need more power to crunch data that's available for you in the cloud to make better decisions quickly, to respond to incidents? And, specifically, I'd look at thinking about your infrastructure as ephemeral. Instead of maybe patching, different cloud infrastructure, perhaps you just throw it away and start over when it gets penetrated with a certain level of vulnerabilities. You have to do as much end-of-life analysis under those considerations. So you can think about metrics like identity metrics, vulnerability management, health metrics. That is going to be an important metric for you to have. And then, cloud audit, looking at open cloud instances, and then just thinking about how do you utilize the data that you have in the cloud to get better metrics instead of chasing data on-prem in different servers and systems. So a lot of opportunity, I think, around metrics, and certainly a reset opportunity for security leaders.
That's great, Tony. Joe, let's get your perspective on metrics and kind of performance management around really truly understanding how do you judge cloud success here, and then we'll kind of then we'll take some final comments here as we wrap up and some final insights and advice with the panelists here. But Joe, just any quick perspective on the metric side of really understanding if you're having cloud success or not.
Sure. Well, let's tie this back to how we started, right? The why we moved to cloud, we all agreed was to drive better business results. So I think that's the top category of measurement. So looking at the new customer acquisition rates, the new revenues, the new operating expense efficiencies, maybe even an agility metric where you can actually measure your ability to support new programs via the flexibility of cloud. But then beyond the business results, right, we also want to look at security control progress in terms of breadth and depth, coverage and effectiveness. and then tying that into risk management results, even if just qualitative, depending upon where you are with utilizing risk frameworks to chart your progress, your maturity journey, but fitting that within that dialogue that you're having across the executive team and the board so that you can be aligned on decision making and investment. And then last but not least, charting compliance results, right? Compliance is a necessary evil in business, and being able to approach each audit with confidence is important, and to continue to advance that so that each audit is a confident discussion about business evolution, so that the auditor is left with what they need to give you that confirmation, and to identify the areas where you still need to develop, right? So those are some key things that we see people measuring.
Excellent. So at this time, I'd love to, appreciate the panelists and the discussion and dialogue. It's been fantastic. I'd love to, at this time, have you share any final thoughts or advice for the audience and attendees today around today's discussion, and then we'll move and transition into our Q&A session real quickly after that. So Kurt, can you maybe start us out?
Sure. So you've heard a lot of good advice, and I think I'll sum it up. My thoughts on it is the cloud is new and exciting opportunity to further your business. It's got a lot of new technology that continues to advance on literally almost a daily basis, but don't get ahead of yourself. You have to be thoughtful about how you're going to utilize that technology and for what purposes, and how you're going to actually make it work for your organization. I think what I've seen a lot is people getting out over their skis. I think Joe may have mentioned it earlier. The business often is dragging the technology people into the cloud and for functionality. And what I've seen too often is the business gets down the road, and even the technology side of the business can grasp the fundamental architecture and underlying infrastructure enablement for using the cloud, but oftentimes the security lags, and if the security gets too far behind, then it becomes an awkward situation where the business is driving down and they don't even understand that they've opened themselves up to a lot of additional risk because security is trying to catch up. So I think ensuring that security has a seat at the table early on in the process, in the planning process, and in that whole how are we going to go about this process is really a key takeaway for me, is don't leave the security for the end. Don't assume that in many cases the security reports up under the CIO. Don't always assume that the CIO's got that as his primary focus. Make sure that security is included very early on, because I think even Tony mentioned, one of the big challenges is the whole DevOps and adding security into the DevOps process. With developers now promoting code and doing all of the support of code, it's very easy for them to be beholden to the business and not be thinking about or spending enough time ensuring that security is built in. And as we talk about infrastructure as code, we have to start thinking about security as code, and even compliance as code. So that's why the security needs to be brought into the equation very early on.
That's fantastic advice, Kurt. Joe, your final comments, advice.
Yeah, I love the reminder about the DevOps situation is the situation we're now solving for. We've got some great new modern tech stacks to leverage, and it's an opportunity to reset or at least evolve. I like those previous comments. I would echo them. But also know your mindset. Don't become something you're not just because the cloud is prompting you into new territory. So figure out how proactive you are going to be, how aggressive you're going to be about customizing technology and make that show up in your strategy and your architecture. Then surround yourself with the partners that you need to play that role and get help where you need help. And then I would just reinforce the fact that, security shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be built in the architecture, and increasingly identity governance, right? That's, that the specificity of controlling who has access to what is now what the auditors need to know, and you need to know, and therefore building that in from the beginning is key.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah,
and
Mark,
Tony, your closing remarks?
Yeah, Mark, I'd just like to leave the audience with 5 things. I'll give them, kind of 5 suggestions that they can take away from here is, and they're all questions. And these are things that, you can ask or you can probe on at your enterprise. I'd say number 1, truly understand the business. How are they defining this digital transformation? How is the enterprise thinking with regard to new business and technology operating models, and why do they want to move to the cloud? I think those will give you some interesting insights into how you leverage your program. I think secondly, and I talked about this early on, is what are the cultural impacts on your cyber personnel, your tech teams, and how are they affected by digital? Are you considering those as organizational risks and requiring new talent or new roles? Are thinking about managing that overtly as a risk. Number 3, have you performed a risk assessment, and did you work with a third party that gave you a digital scorecard of your readiness around business tech and cyber to become digital? How is one of the things that you have to understand is how is the attack surface expanding or changing with regard to digital operations, and again, how are we managing that risk? Number 4, are we sequencing this in the right order, right? Are required changes for moving to the cloud and becoming more digital for cyber tech in the business, are we doing this in the right order, or are we just moving to the cloud and hoping in the future cybersecurity and our controls will come along, right? Sequencing, as we talked about earlier, is going to be really important for you to be successful. And then lastly, you got to measure the effectiveness of the cyber program as you transform it digitally. What are the right investments to make, and how are we doing along that journey? So hopefully those 5 things will, enable you guys to walk away from here and, start being introspective and sharing with others, how this movement to the cloud can be done effectively.
Brilliant thoughts and advice, Tony. Really appreciate those. Real quickly, as we come close to the end of our webinar, we'll shift to Q&A. I've been monitoring some questions that have come in. We'll grab one here real quick, share some very, very quick insights to it, and then we'll kind of wrap up here. The one I have for any panelist that wants to go jump in, and maybe just one panelist would answer this just due to time. How do you know your organization is ready to move to the cloud? And again, just open to any panelist that wants to share a quick, brief insight into this question.
Well, I'll jump in, Mark, if that's okay. This is Tony.
Sure.
I would keep it really simple. I think, after talking about those things that, will help you understand kind of where you are and what you need to do, is I would say, is cyber and your control environment built for the cloud? And are you ready to pull the enterprise through so that they can be very successful? Versus the alternative, which is, the enterprise is struggling with the challenge of getting to the cloud. When you put cyber first and you become cloud first in your cyber program, you're really going to become a set of heroes, because it's going to allow your enterprise to manage the appropriate risks while moving the business to the cloud or to become digital in a much faster and a much more thoughtful way.
Thanks, Tony. And with that, we are indeed out of time for today. But all those additional submitted questions will be reached out, and we'll personally take time to make sure all questions are addressed. At this time, I want to thank Kurt, Tony, and Joe for your insights in moving to the cloud. Thank you for all attendees for joining our Smartest Path to a Secure Cloud webinar today. Coalfire will be providing a link to the recording of today's webinar via email to all registered attendees and on our Coalfire's corporate website by next Monday. And with that, thank you again and have a wonderful day.